Hello, this is Leonard Jason, and I'm a professor of psychology at DePaul University and the director of the Center for Community Research. Welcome to this presentation on myths about chronic fatigue syndrome. I have nothing to disclose. Today I'm going to talk to you about an illness that has been known as chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS. But you should know that other parts of the world and many other patient groups prefer the term myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME. So in this talk, I'll refer to it as CFS and ME. Patients with this illness are more functionally impaired than many of the major illnesses listed on this slide, including congestive heart failure. Even though this illness is so debilitating, you may ask why so many patients feel very stigmatized. Today we'll go over a number of myths that have caused this stigma, but first I want to share with you the studies that indicate patients have been stigmatized. For example, studies have reported that 95% of individuals seeking medical treatment for ME and CFS reported feelings of estrangement. 85% of clinicians view ME and CFS as wholly or partially psychiatric, and hundreds of thousands of patients cannot find a single knowledgeable and sympathetic physician to take care of them. The first myth is that this is a rare disorder. In fact, about 0.4% of the population has this illness, so it's not rare. In addition, we found that Latinos had the highest rates, and rates among African Americans were just a little higher than whites, as this bar graph shows. In fact, our study showed that women with CFS had rates higher than women with HIV, women with lung cancer, women with breast cancer. Clearly, this myth that the CFS is a yuppie flu disease is not true, and it's not a rare disorder. The second myth is that the case definition is both reliable and accurate. And we're going to go over this in a little more detail. But let me give you an example of some of the problems with the case definition. For example, separating major depressive disorder from CFS. Well, a person with major depression often feels self-reproach and often feels better with exercise. This is just the opposite with the person with CFS or ME. So even though with proper knowledge, you can differentiate CFS and ME from patients who have major depressive disorder, in your office, if you don't ask the right questions and have the right tests, it can be difficult to differentiate these two conditions. And one needs to be very careful or collaborate with those with mental health training, such as a psychiatrist or psychologist. As you can see in this slide, there's a stack of playing cards to make a pyramid. However, if the foundation or the first level of these playing cards is not sturdy, the middle and upper layers are vulnerable to collapsing. In a sense, all science works like this. A sturdy foundation is required for any progress to be made. The case definition is the foundation for any illness. A case definition is a set of rules that allows investigators and clinicians to determine who has and who does not have an illness. If we cannot do this diagnostic activity in a reliable way, all progress in a scientific area will be shaky and vulnerable to collapse. The case definition has been referred to as the Fukuda and other criteria, and it was developed in 1994. And the symptoms are on this slide. The problem is that a person would only need 4 out of these 8 symptoms to meet the CFS criteria. But the 3 symptoms, unrefreshing sleep, post-exertional malaise, and memory and concentration problems, might not occur, and yet they are key cardinal symptoms of this illness. So here's the problem. A person might not have the key symptoms and still be classified with this illness. Considerable work suggests that post-exertional malaise, unrefreshing sleep, and neurocognitive problems are key markers of this illness, and there are now efforts to focus more on these types of symptoms for a diagnosis. A third myth is that these symptoms are measured appropriately. In fact, you might ask why one needs to be careful about how you are assessing these symptoms. So let's consider one of the more common psychiatric illnesses, and that's major depressive disorder. Do you think that people with this condition can be easily differentiated from those with ME or CFS? Here's the problem. A person with major depressive disorder could be inappropriately diagnosed with ME and CFS, and that's because both conditions have a number of common symptoms. Do you know what they are? Major depression often involves chronic fatigue and 4 other minor symptoms that are also common in ME and CFS, and these symptoms include unrefreshing sleep, joint pain, muscle pain, and impairment in concentration. However, if you ask the right questions, you can differentiate these two conditions with 100% accuracy, and these questions involve the percent of time fatigue was reported, post-exertional malaise severity, unrefreshing sleep severity, confusion, disorientation severity, shortness of breath, and severity of self-reproach. For example, patients with major depressive disorder have self-reproach. Those with CFS and ME don't. Let me give you here a clear example of how to differentiate the conditions. If you asked the patients who had been experiencing fatigue for 6 months or longer, there'd be no difference between the responses of those with major depressive disorder or ME and CFS. With rates of general fatigue would be very high for both conditions as compared to a healthy control, as indicated on this graph. However, if you were asked the patient about the severity of the fatigue, not just the occurrence, but the severity over the past 6 months, then you'd find the patients with ME and CFS have much more severe fatigue than those with major depressive disorder or controls, as indicated on this graph. You see, fatigue can occur in mild to moderate levels, and with depression, it's often in those areas. But with more severe fatigue, it's what's experienced by patients with ME and CFS. In fact, we can look at biological data for ways to show the differences, as indicated on this slide, where you see stimulated cytokines for patients with CFS and ME, and the cluster pattern is very different from the next slide of healthy controls. This slide shows healthy controls, and their network of cytokines is very different than patients with ME and CFS. We've also found that patients with ME and CFS have patterns very different from those with MS. Another myth is that the term CFS is non-stigmatizing. How do you think patients feel about the term CFS? Well, this brings us to our fourth issue. In the mid-1950s to 1980s, the illness was referred to as actually myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, but it was renamed in 1988 by the CDC to CFS. There was considerable patient dissatisfaction with this term CFS, as they felt the term trivialized the seriousness of the illness, because everyone feels fatigue at some time. For example, if you called bronchitis chronic cough syndrome, that illness would also be trivialized. Our group has actually done some work with how terms can affect attributions, and we found that the more medically sounding name, like ME, does change attributions of medical personnel, so they perceive an illness like CFS to be more serious. Another myth is that patients are malingering. Some have characterized patients with ME and CFS as attributing their symptoms to physical causes, being preoccupied by physical limitations, not maintaining regular activity, and maintaining a self-defeating preoccupation with symptoms. Our group has reviewed this psychogenic model and found it does not characterize patients with this illness. In fact, we found that symptoms worsen when the body and brain of patients are pressured to function beyond their current capacities. And we stress the use of pacing or staying within the patient's energy envelope, with the objective to stay within energy boundaries. Using such a strategy over time, patients can restore some of their energy, lessen pain and other symptoms, and lessen their illness severity. This is not a cure, but a way of coping with the illness. In other words, we don't challenge patients' beliefs in a medical cause for ME and CFS. We recommend that patients with ME and CFS pace their activity according to their available energy resources by staying within their energy envelope. So, to summarize, flawed epidemiology suggested that this illness was rare. That was a myth. It was a mistaken belief that patients had a yuppie flu illness, which wasn't true. Another myth has been the case definition is good at identifying patients, but what has happened is that ME and CFS studies have often included patients with other illnesses, such as major depressive disorder. In addition, many of the symptoms have not been sensitively assessed, and this has also caused major diagnostic problems. Another myth is that the name is a good one, but CFS has ended up trivializing patients, and many patients now reject this term. Finally, some treatment professionals have considered these patients as malingerers, or as having an hysterical neurotic illness, and this is another myth that has further stigmatized patients. Thank you for taking part in this discussion on CFS and ME. I look forward to your comments and questions in the discussion stream.